Okay, we're gonna get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Samip Mallick. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the South Asian American Digital Archive. It is so great to see all of you here today. I get such a jolt when I see all of your faces popping up on my screen. So lovely to see so many of your friends and familiar faces, as well as so many new friends as well. For those who have not been to a SAADA event, a SAADA virtual event, at least in the past 9 months, you'll know, those who have attended will know that my Zoom role model is Miss Steph, who is my daughter Sejal, who's 4 years old, who's somewhere in one of these boxes on the screen. I can't see her at the moment, but she's somewhere out there. Her preschool teacher, who is just a master at getting nonverbal communication and nonverbal participation in Zoom meetings. And with Miss Steph's permission, I've been using some of her tricks in SAADA events. And so Miss Steph basically uses 3 tactics to get nonverbal participation, which I'm hoping you'll humor me with and do with me so that we can practice them and use them later in the event. So the first is that Miss Steph asks everyone to tickle their head. Can everyone please join me in tickling their head? I love it. Can everyone please touch their heart? That's the next one. Can you please touch your heart? And the third and final is the classic spirit fingers for applause. Can everyone give a round of spirit fingers? Awesome. Thank you so much. So for those who don't know, SAADA is an organization that was started 12 years ago. I'm one of the co-founders of the organization. And it's an organization started really recognizing that stories from our community, from the South Asian American community, simply weren't systematically being collected or preserved by any other institutions, any other archives, any museums, any other heritage institutions. And fearing not only that our community stories weren't being heard, but moreover that they were in danger of being lost entirely. Over the last 12 years, what we've been able to accomplish is to build the world's largest publicly accessible collection of stories and materials about South Asian Americans, and make those materials and stories all freely available to the public through our website, which is saada.org, SAADA.org. And we also do walking tours and artist collaborations and educational programming and a variety of different other things to share these stories across the country. This work that we've been doing for the last 12 years has only been possible because of the support of our donors. And I see so many of our donors and supporters here today. It's so great to see you. And so, and honestly, and in fact, the only reason that SAADA exists today is because of the support of our donors and our donor community. And so if you've made a donation at any time over the last 12 years to SAADA, can you please join me in touching your heart so that I can thank you personally? Can you please touch your heart if you've made a donation to SAADA? Thank you so much for your support. I truly, truly appreciate it. As many of you probably know, it's hard not to know, we're in the midst of our year-end fundraising effort for SAADA currently. And we've set our most ambitious fundraising goal ever. We're aiming to raise $100,000 to support SAADA's work by the end of the year. And so for those who have supported us in the past, and those who are new to SAADA's work now, one of the reasons we've set such an ambitious goal is because we realize how important the work it is that we're doing now is to the next generation of South Asian Americans. And so that I hope that you'll consider making a donation, joining us in this effort to document and preserve our community stories. And as a bonus, and this is a save the date as well, for any past, current, or future donors, in 2 weeks on Sunday, December 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to be having our SAADA holiday party, our first time doing it on Zoom. There will be arts and crafts, there'll be music, there'll be a poetry contest, there will be snacks. If you bring snacks, there will be snacks. It's BYOS, bring your own snacks. And so please look out for an email for that, anyone who's donated in the past, and please do join us in a couple of weeks. It's going to be a lot of fun. What brings us together today is thinking about our own personal and family histories. And I think, at least for me, what got me first interested in thinking about community history was an interest in my own family history, wanting to understand my place in the world and my place in time. So there's a few details I want to share about today's event. The first is that we're defining family very broadly here. It could be your biological family, a chosen family, community, or even personal materials of your own. The advice and guidance that we're sharing today is going to be advice that should be applicable regardless of the circumstances or the kinds of materials that you're working with. So we've generally and broadly divided the event into 4 sections. The first on preserving physical materials, the second on digitization, the third on digital preservation, and the fourth on oral history interviewing. How do you collect stories that may not exist in material form? How do you ensure that those stories are preserved? And we're so fortunate to have archivists and oral historians with a long history, longtime SAADA collaborators who are here to kind of guide us through these processes. Ayshea, Umber, Neel, Nicolette, and Tara. And their bios are in the event program that you received over email. So please learn more about them there and also learn about the sponsors who made today's event possible and support them as well. We're so we're not gonna have a time for formal Q&A during the event itself. There's just too many of us here today. But what I would ask you instead to do is to add your questions into the chat. There's many folks here with archival background, so we'll try to answer as many questions as we can in the chat. And then this is not going to be the last event of this sort. We're going to do more events like this in the year ahead. So if we see that there's a kind of question that's coming up again and again in the chat, we'll make sure that we organize an event in the future that it tries to address that question directly. We're also going to be sharing a resource sheet following the event. So tomorrow, look out for a resource sheet that has more links and resources that will be useful to you in your own projects. And we'll also be sharing a recording of the event. So as you can see, it's being recorded. We'll share that recording with you afterwards so you can watch it again. You can share with your own friends or family. And the last thing I'll mention is that we're going to be launching a new SAADA project early in 2021, where we'll be asking you to submit some of these family materials to us for the archive. And so look out for that as well. I'll share a little bit more about that at the very end of this meeting, but look out for that early in the new year as well. Okay, so now starting with a question for all of you. Can you please tickle your head if you have a family story or family materials that you're interested in archiving and preserving? Can you join me in tickling your head if that's the case? Okay, that seems like it's a lot of you. I can only see 50 people on the screen at once, but it seems like a lot of people have that. And I'm realizing now that one of the perhaps challenges of Mrs. Steff's methodology is that head tickling is not the best method for scientific inquiry exactly. So I'm going to turn now to a Zoom poll, perhaps a slightly better methodology. And this poll includes two questions. The first is, where are you in the family archiving process? And it'll give you a variety of options, like, are you just starting to think about family archiving? Are you in the middle of a project? Maybe you're interested in the topic, but you don't have a specific project in mind. So that's the first question. And the second is, what are the types of materials that you're most interested in preserving? Paper, books, photographs, VHS, oral histories, etc. By answering these questions, you'll give our panelists and me a better sense of the kinds of materials you're looking at and where you are in the process, so we can tailor our answers accordingly. So I'm going to open this poll, if you don't mind taking a minute just to answer it, and then we'll have a sense of where everyone is in this process. Okay, I hope everyone is seeing that on their screen now, or at least most of you. Does everyone see the poll? And if so, please take a minute just to answer the poll. Okay, so we have a good number of results now. I'm going to end the poll and share the results so everyone can see kind of where we are as a group. So as you can see, it seems like a lot of people are just starting to think about a family history project. Some folks are in the middle of working through a project, and some are interested in the topic, but maybe don't have a specific project that they're working on at this time. Looking at the kinds of materials that people are most interested in, it looks like photographs is something that a lot of people are interested in. It said 70% of people who responded are interested in photographs. A lot of people, all of the above, and kind of it's divided very equally beyond that, papers, oral histories as well. So this gives us a sense of where people are in this workshop, thinking about their own stories and only family materials, as well as the kinds of materials that they're thinking about. So now I'm going to turn to the panelists and kind of guide us through a series of questions to help address some of the kinds of questions that you may have while you're doing your own family archiving projects. And I'm going to start with kind of I guess maybe the most basic and important question, which is, where do you start? And I'll start with a couple of kind of more philosophical questions about how you do this work. The first question is this: so how do you get started? What are the kinds of questions that you should ask yourself when starting an archiving project? And I'm going to turn to Umber to maybe try to answer that first. Umber?
Hi, my name is Abbas. I'm currently serving as the president of the SAADA Board of Directors, but I've been a practicing oral historian for a long time. And so for me, and I'm also somebody who has done some work with my own family, which is actually how I first got in touch with Samip and with SAADA, by interviewing my dad and contributing an oral history with him. And I did that now several years ago, but then when my dad passed away, I started to get interested in a whole bunch of other materials that he had. And I think one of the things that is really important in starting a project is doing it when you're really ready, because the process of collecting materials and going through them is as much emotional as it is physical, especially when you're working with materials from your own family. We have a lot of attachments to those objects, to those histories, to those stories. And I think in order to do a really effective job, it's best to make sure that you are emotionally prepared to get into the process, in addition to any of the other sort of logistical considerations.
Thanks, Umber. Is there anything else that anyone else would add to that?
I think, oh, hi everyone. My name is Ayshea Khan. I'm also a member of SAADA's Board of Directors, and I'm also an Asian American Community Archivist at the Austin History Center. And I would also recommend identifying other people that could be alongside you in the process. You may have inherited or been deemed the person to handle your family's records, but there may be a lot of other people connected to your family or friends that can help you process this really overwhelming task at times. So folks not only to help you build memories over the materials that you're preserving, but also building a network of support and care for the collection into the future. I remember when my grandfather passed away and they sold my grandparents' home, a lot of my mom's photographs and drawings that she did when she was in art school were just sort of thrown away because only one family member was in charge of everything in the home. And so if there had been a network to kind of signal to one another the really valuable family history that was in the home, that could have been prevented. So that's one thing I would recommend.
Hi, I'll jump in as well. My name is Neel Agrawal, and I manage the South Asia Open Archives based at Center for Research Libraries. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I've been involved with SAADA for a few years. Yeah, thanks for everyone for being here today. I think a lot of it is, has to do when you're ready, but sometimes it's just out of necessity too. I recently went home back to Michigan and had to clean out about 7 or 8 boxes of materials. And so just out of that sort of that work, I was able to find a lot of my sort of family photos and different artifacts. So I would also recommend just taking it in stride as well, and doing it sort of in steps. So don't feel like you have to do everything all at once, but maybe sort of start weeding out some physical materials, and then next you can sort of start prioritizing, and then later get to the digitization portion of the project.
Nicolette, you're going to add something as well?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Nicolette Khan. I'm currently living in Minneapolis, but I technically work in DC with National Public Radio and their archives. And just kind of building off of what other people have already said, just like institutional and community archives have to think about a user when they're curating their collections, I would encourage you to do the same for your personal and family collections. And that'll also help you kind of think about what to keep and what not to keep, thinking about what stories certain objects tell, or who the collection represents, who can answer questions about names, dates, or places that have kind of fallen off the radar, and how you can best share these materials with the rest of your family and friends.
Hi everyone, I'm Maharjan. I'm the processing archivist for Rutgers University. With this, kind of what Neel was saying, that, you know, make it a slow process as you get into it, but it's also, you're going to need to make some tough decisions about what to keep, because sadly, we don't all have very large spaces to keep all of these family photos and to keep all of the things that we need to and we want to keep. And so there needs to be some tough decisions made sometimes. And with that, it's really thinking about what's the best of, what are the things we need to keep. You know, if you have a birthday party and you have 100 photos, do we really need to keep all 100 photos, or can we just keep maybe 5? And so unfortunately, sometimes it does require some tough decisions to be made. But as Umber had said, do this when you're ready, and don't throw something out just because I'm saying maybe you should only keep 5. Keep the things that are going to be important to you, and keep the things that you are going to treasure.
That's a great segue into the next question, Tara, which is, you know, how do you know what you're going to treasure years down the road? How do you know which materials you should keep? Are there any general kind of any general advice or guidance that you can provide, you or others provide for us, or just kinds of questions that we can be asking ourselves when thinking about which materials we may want to keep and which we might be ready to say goodbye to?
Well, I think a good rule is, you know, an archive is your original materials. And so with that, you don't necessarily need to keep a New York Times article or a whole New York Times because something historic happened that day. Now, if there's a birth announcement or a wedding announcement, yes, obviously keep that clipping, but you don't need to keep the entire newspaper. And so those are kind of, it's a good way to make sure that you're keeping the things that are really true to your family. The New York Times, I promise everyone, is doing their own archiving. They have copies of it. You don't need to be the person who's keeping it for them.
So it sounds like you're saying, like, think about what's unique to your family, to your own collection, and prioritize those materials. That's really helpful. Does anyone else have advice, just general guidance in terms of thinking about what to keep and what to say goodbye to?
I'll jump in. On the one hand, you know, there's of course restraints that you may have with your physical or digital space. That's always something we always have in the back of our heads, but don't be too constrained by that. Like, don't undersell kind of everyday objects, everyday correspondences that might hold value and tell stories about what your family is like right now for future generations.
Thanks, Nicolette. Anyone else have anything to add on that question? There's a whole Netflix show about this anyway, right? Like does it spark joy? That seems like it's a relevant question as well. But maybe we'll get a Netflix show after this. Anyone else have any advice about thinking about how to know which materials to keep and which to say goodbye to?
As an oral historian, I think one of the considerations is thinking about the timing. You know, or maybe timing's my story for today, but if you have a family member whose story you can collect now, collect it now, no matter what that means, whatever sketchy form it may be in. But that really gets to a question about condition that I think some of the people who work more with paper and documents might be able to respond to is you'd like to get a story while somebody's memory is full and rich and available, instead of waiting a little while so that you can be more prepared. So timing really matters in terms of getting something and then being able to hold on to it. You can always do another one later when you get better equipment if you need to.
I think that's really great advice. I think often myself and probably many of us are waiting for the perfect conditions, right? Like, this will be the perfect moment. I'll finally digitize these materials. I'll finally sit down and do this interview. And maybe that's a myth, right? There isn't really a perfect moment for anything to happen. It's really about capturing stories while you can and doing the best that you can with it. Thanks, that's really helpful. Any other advice here before we move on? Okay, so say now we've figured out what materials we want to keep. Now we're thinking specifically about preserving physical materials. And Ayshea and Tara, I'll turn to you with these questions. So say you've decided, okay, I want to keep these photographs, I want to keep these materials in my home. How do you actually do it? Like, can you walk us through some general guidance, some general advice that you might have on how to ensure that physical materials are preserved safely in a home environment?
Yeah, I'll jump in to get started. So unfortunately, the places that we often think to store things, being the basement, the attic, or the garage, are unfortunately kind of the worst places to be keeping things. So you kind of want to avoid places with fluctuating temperatures or humidity. So you want to try to find a place that has a relative humidity of about 30 to 50%. So that's gonna kind of stay neutral. You want to avoid places with high light exposure. So you don't want to hang materials on the wall that is going to be getting sun all day, because it will cause an image or an item to fade over time. When you're thinking about spaces, you want to avoid places that are going to flood or have mold or rodents or any other pests. You want to keep them away from machines that are going to give off heat or air conditioning units that can leak. And so a good place to kind of think about keeping places is maybe on a bookshelf or maybe even a closet, as they're not going to be places that will experience too much of that different fluctuation. And you obviously want to keep materials, any boxes or things off of the floor. So maybe get something to raise the materials off, because God forbid there is some kind of water leak, whether it's your refrigerator starts to leak water or something like that. And it may not be something that you would think about. So you always want to keep your materials elevated in some kind of way.
Yeah, that's all great advice, Tara. And I think that I would also, as general guidelines, when you're ready to maybe take material out of the attic or maybe off the bookshelf, when you're doing this periodic assessing of what you have, make sure that you kind of have a dedicated, clean workspace to handle those materials. So again, when I'm working, I don't have any drinks with an open container. I don't like to eat around the material. Again, not only could you run the risk of spilling something on a one-of-a-kind photograph, but it could also attract pests that really love to eat paper material. So in addition to a clean workspace, make sure you have clean hands. I think we are all well practiced now in washing our hands. All those oils that we have on our hands can easily smudge or stain a photograph or a correspondence, a letter or a recipe. And if you're handling photographs and you happen to have a pair of gloves to wear, that's even better. But again, if you don't, that's okay. Just try to handle photographs on their sides. Never put your fingertips on the image side of the photograph. And again, when handling, a general rule is never stress whatever you're holding. So if you are holding a book, for example, you don't want to just pull it from the top of the spine off the bookshelf. You really want your materials to be supported, because over time it can really damage the spine of your book, and then the pages are going to begin to fall out, kind of like this. Again, if you have something that's rolled, it's great to flatten it, but if it doesn't really want to flatten, it's going to start to crack. Don't push it, or don't try to tear a photograph out of an album. You really want to be gentle and kind of listen to the material. And there may be times when you're going to need a professional archivist or conservator to kind of help you. Don't try to go in and DIY it, because you may really run the risk of harming the physical item.
And I just want to add one thing. The whole white glove idea is totally like a myth when it comes to archives. It is something to be used around photographs, but don't feel like you definitely should not wear white cotton gloves around paper, because it actually can cause, if there is a small tear in your paper, and it can catch your glove and you can rip an item. So I know a lot of TV shows and things will show people with white gloves. It's a definite lie they're telling you about archives.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And so actually maybe on that same vein, thinking about specific kinds of materials, how you mentioned that there's like a difference in handling photographs versus handling letters and other paper materials. Ayshea, could you talk specifically about paper materials like letters, postcards, recipe cards, and also like newspapers and books? What's specific about those that and how they need to be handled and kept?
Yeah, of course. So with paper materials, so letters, recipes, postcards, those kinds of items, always try to keep them flattened. So if you have a letter inside of an envelope, take the envelope or take the letter out of the envelope and unfold it and leave it flat. Also, when you're going through your family materials, you may find a lot of extras like metal staples, paper clips, rubber bands, all of these materials that we think keeps our things together, actually produces a lot of rust and staining on these paper materials. So it's really important to try to take those things out as you can. Even frames or sometimes older photographs, which Tara will talk about, will come in these really fancy, like multicolored cardboard frames or enclosures. A lot of those things, again, emit gases that can sort of harm your material and cause them to discolor and degrade over time. So freeing all of your paper materials of extra things like that is a really great first step to help preserve them over time. Again, recipes, those are, recipes are just such a wonderful way to keep a family's history alive. And I also really just love the way old recipes look, if they've even taken the time to write them down at all. Usually they're on scraps of paper, maybe like a Post-it note or an index card. And while they're really beautiful pieces, I would try to encapsulate them in some way, like put them in a sleeve. They make these really great archival safe plastic sleeves that you can slip things in, because again, that colored paper, when they're touching each other, can kind of harm the paper material over time. The same thing with newspaper. So, I see a lot of newspaper clippings. Sometimes you clip them and make an album, or maybe you just saved one page from a newspaper that's featuring a loved one. Newspaper wasn't designed to last forever. Again, it can disintegrate over time, especially if it's folded, but also if that newspaper is being kept with other paper materials like a letter, that too can stain whatever is touching the newsprint. So I either recommend digitizing that article if you have the resources to do so, because a scanned copy will still, save that important information. Or if you have an album where things are clipped together, or you really don't want to part with the physical item, you can get buffered paper to kind of interleave in the pages to kind of protect it. I tried to bring some examples, but so this is like a clipping album, and you can see like with the photographs and newspaper clippings that they have this sort of paper in between. Sorry, gonna hold it up a little bit. But that can kind of prevent the staining of the newsprint. Tara, is there any other sort of paper things? I can move into books. I know not that many people mentioned books, but I would say just if you have a lot of older books, try to keep things on the same weight and size on your bookshelf. Make sure that they're being stored upright. If it's a really oversized book, like maybe a scrapbook or a photo album, you can keep that lying flat. You really just want to make sure that there's not a lot of pressure, again, on the spine of the book. And if you have something that's really fragile, I would recommend either wrapping it in archival safe buffered paper, or you can even make, there's instructions online on how to make your own box to really protect it from the light and keep it supported so it doesn't continue to fall apart.
Thanks, Ayshea. Tara, did you want to add anything else in terms of paper? And then also, could you talk specifically about photographs and slides and negatives, and how there was a lot of interest, as you saw in the poll, about photographs specifically. Could you talk about anything special that people should know about that?
Yeah, there are tons of different types of photographs. There's actually a whole book about photographs and how to care for them from archives. You can see it's very thick. And so I'm not going to talk about everything today because I don't have that kind of time. But the things I'm going to talk about today are basically the more modern physical forms of photographs. So instant photographs like a Polaroid, but also black and white and color print photographs. So basically the mid-1900s onward. Basic things to know about photographs is that any color photograph will fade over time, and instant photographs like a Polaroid will fade faster. Photographs should ideally be stored individually in like a plastic polyester jacket of some kind, or as Ayshea showed, it with buffered paper sleeves. Some photographs can be stored together, but you want to make sure that the enamel is not, the front of the photographs are not touching each other, because it can cause them to stick over time, and then getting those apart is incredibly difficult. So you're going to want to make sure that they're shelved properly in that kind of way. The negatives that you may get or that people may still have at home are a great way to recreate photographs that may have been lost over time. And they should also be stored in polyester sleeves. And ideally, you'd keep those negatives in a separate location from the photographs, because if something was to get destroyed, you're going to want to be able to recreate those photos. And if everything gets wet in the same location, it becomes less helpful over time. The slides, you can get slide sheets that will hold all of your images together, and you can put those into 3-ring binders. So I know we talked earlier about having, a network of people. Maybe there's someone else in your family who can then hold on to those negatives to make sure that that continues to be something that can be used over time. And again, you're going to want to be selective of what you keep and how many you keep. And that's going to kind of keep the number of images, the number of things that you can preserve, to keep everything together.
Great, thank you so much, Shara. So now turning to the question of digitization. So turning now to Neel and Nicolette, maybe we'll start with a kind of philosophical question as well. We talked a little bit about how to know or how to think about which physical materials you may want to keep and which you may be ready to say goodbye to. What about thinking about digitization? Like, how do you prioritize what to digitize? What are the things that you would think about in that process?
Sure, I'll start with that. So I think there's a lot of factors. And again, I think that it's important to sort of document your factors too. I think that can really help when going through your materials. But it could be the importance of the event, the condition of the actual item itself. I think a lot of times we have materials that are in somewhat poor condition, and so that might actually be more of a case for digitizing your item for sort of long-term preservation needs. Nicolette, do you have any other factors?
Yeah, I would just also stress that starting with an inventory is probably the best advice that I could give. I know that I can tell from the chat that people are like starting at kind of different places in their projects. And a few people have asked for like a template on how to get started with this. But including kind of the factors of what risk the object might be at and what kind of value, and by value, I mean cultural value to your family or yourself, having those as kind of parts of the rubric or spreadsheet that you're using to create that inventory will help you decide what things might need to be digitized first. And also, as far as risk, like there's a lot of things that we could be talking about when we talk about risk. Like, have you forgotten the names or people in a photo, for example? That's a type of risk that you might want to resolve earlier on as you start to think about the digitization project and sharing with other people. Also, is the object susceptible to data loss? Like, is it like a digital object? And also, is it stored on a third-party platform, like a collection of Facebook photos? So these are all things to think about too.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Neil.
Oh, just also saying that I think there's sort of a curation element here too. So how are you creating your own family history? And are you curating it around a certain time period, over a certain family member or a theme? So I think that's really important to think about as well. And also part of this, these exercises, I think inherently is that we're changing as people over time. And so sometimes our priorities shift. And so when we're looking back, I think it's important to think about what do you actually, sort of value now at this point in your life.
Thank you both. That's really helpful. So first I want to talk about this term obsolete media. And I wonder, Neil, if you could define that term for us, but then also talk about maybe the kinds of materials that might be included in that term currently. What is obsolete media and what are the kinds of objects, media types that are included in that currently?
Sure. Yeah, so obsolete media generally refers to media formats that have been superseded have been superseded by newer technologies. So for example, we could be looking at photos and we could have like a hard copy of a photo, perhaps that was taken 20 years ago, versus a digital version of a photo. And so, with preservation and with access, I think that's sort of an argument to digitize materials. Not only are you preserving your materials for long term, but you can open up the access to your materials through digitization. So I think that's a argument for digital photographs. Some of the other formats that you could sort of consider obsolete could be like VHS tapes, CDs. Nicolette, do you have any other sort of examples?
I would just say that there's some conversation going on in the chat. You might be surprised like what is an obsolete media or like soon to be obsolete media. Sometimes I think the data loss conversation goes well with this. Like VHS are obsolete media, but they're actually a little more stable than something like a CD or a DVD. So that's just another thing in this very complicated matrix to consider when thinking about digitization.
So one of the things I realized, and maybe this is a case for many of you here, is like my entire childhood is on obsolete media. And so what do you do now with like you have these VHS tapes and cassette tapes? God, I recorded so many hours of great songs off the radio. Like, what do we do with that stuff? If we want to digitize it, how do you get it digitized if you don't even perhaps have a way to play it in your own home?
I think that you'd have to find a service in order to convert those the format from, for example, from VHS to digital, and that is a bit tough too to find a local service. But there are, I think we could help identify some local services, as well as some perhaps around the country that you could send your your materials to. I know we created a resource list that we're sharing today, and I'd really encourage everyone to look at that resource list, to help think about how to convert their the formats of their materials.
I would also say that don't be afraid to do things by yourself if you feel like you are kind of tech savvy. Also, reach out to friends and family members who are interested in that kind of stuff. Like I have reformatted and digitized so many different types of materials, but I still all the time reach out to friends when I'm thinking about doing something for myself at home. If you go on Craigslist or the thrift store, you can a lot of times find things like VHS players and cassette decks. And then all you really need is a simple analog to digital converter, which sounds intense, but it's something that you can easily find at most electronics stores or even at Amazon. And it's pretty simple to find guides online or just talk to someone about how to set something simple like that up at home. And it's really kind of similar to just setting up a scanner at home. Scanners aren't super expensive, so if you have a lot of photos, I would encourage you to think about investing in a scanner, but also don't feel like you need to get that fancy. If you just want to take pictures with your phone, that is a good start and it's better than nothing. So there are fancy archival standards, and then there's also just preservation or steps you can take with the resources that you have. So don't feel overwhelmed by standards that institutions and other archives might use.
Yeah, and there may be some apps even on your phone, you know, for scanning materials.
Well, could you talk a little bit more about that? So, you know, so for some materials that we may not be able to digitize at home, we may be able to find a commercial service that can help us with that. And obviously the consideration there is that it can be very expensive, which I think I saw some people in the chat already attest to. There's also, Nicolette, like you're pointing out, maybe technologies that we can buy to help us do some of that conversion at home. But then, you know, for like a home digitization project, say you buy a scanner and you're ready to I'm ready to start scanning my photographs. Can you talk a little bit about what you need, like equipment wise, like what you could use, and then also what that process is like? How much time do you need to set aside for that kind of process, et cetera? Just anything that you could help that share that would be helpful for people to know.
Well, I would start with doing some samples. And so I would take just a few for example, sample photos or some correspondence, and maybe having a few different types of materials as well. And then thinking about, you know, the sort of considerations for digitization. So what sort of file type do you want to create here? Are you creating a TIFF file? Are you creating a JP2, JPEG, PDF? And also just along those lines, you know, looking at the quality of your image, you know, from those different file types. Also thinking about file size. We might be storing a lot of you know, photos or materials, and you may only have, like, let's say, a terabyte hard drive or 2 terabytes. So it's really important, I think, to keep your file size sort of down to a minimum so that you can maximize the amount of materials that you can store. The only thing with file size, though, is when you start bringing the file size down, you are compromising some quality, I think, of your item. So it could be that you're compromising the resolution, or you might be compressing the item. So I think those are some of the considerations. I also think a lot about file naming. I know we were talking about the inventory earlier, but having a really well thought out file name convention can really help and go a long way. It helps you organize your materials, and also it helps with accessing those materials. And then I also think a lot about folder structure too. So how are you going to organize, you know, these large amounts of materials? So what's your sort of schema for naming your folders and organizing them, sort of a hierarchy of folder structure?
Also, Ayshea just mentioned in the chat, and I forgot to bring up before, a lot of public libraries have digitization labs. I know DC Public Library has one. Also, this is only relevant after the pandemic ends, but a lot of public libraries have a memory lab or something similar set up with equipment that you can bring your materials to, and they'll have an archivist there to help you digitize those materials. A lot of them also have guides, so you can try to mimic what they have set up at the library with some equipment at home. And I think that's going to be on the resource list that we share. But yeah, also I just want to emphasize what Neel said about file naming, whether it's stuff that you have digitized yourself or things that you've received from a vendor. It's really important to have a file name, hopefully something that you can kind of have an idea about what it might be just by looking at it. You know, something, I think someone mentioned in the chat, dates or something to describe the event or maybe the person, depending on how you want to arrange your collection. But that's really important. And also just kind of arranging things in folders and things like that, like you would with a physical collection. I know that there's some more intense conversation going on in the chat about tagging and things like that, which is really exciting. I know we're going to talk about metadata for a little bit at the end of the presentation. But then also, I can't remember if you already mentioned this, Neel, or not, but being a smart cloud consumer is also something to keep in mind. I think it's reasonable to assume most of us aren't going to have like lots of hard drives at home that we're re-upping every 5 years. So as everyone kind of moves more towards the cloud, it's important to know that Google and Facebook aren't holding themselves accountable to preserving that material for you. So you kind of have to put that onus on yourself. Like I know Google just sent out an update to their policy, and they're not going to be preserving a lot of materials necessarily if your account is inactive for 2 years. So things like that are always things you should be thinking about, like actually reading those user agreements and not just sending all those emails to a spam folder.
That's a great segue, Nicolette, into the next set of questions, which is about like once you have these materials digitized, how do you actually ensure that they're digitally preserved? We talked a little bit about physical preservation, photographs, books, etc. What about digital preservation? You mentioned about being a smart cloud consumer, thinking about the services that you're using. Neel and Nicolette, are there any other general principles or like general guidance that you could provide people on ensuring that materials are digitally preserved?
Yeah, I think, well, if the point is for preservation, I would encourage a really high resolution photo or image or high quality item, because you can produce down the road, you can produce surrogate files from that. You can create lower resolution files that you might want to put up on, for people to see. But I think if it's for preservation, I would recommend getting a high quality, and then from there you can sort of scale down your specifications, to decrease the file size, and sort of make it more accessible. At South Asia Open Archives, at the project that I'm managing, we use TIFF files for our master files, so that's what we use for long-term preservation, and it really works out well. I'd also recommend scanning in color or in grayscale as well. And again, from there you can produce lower quality images.
And I would just say, I'm going to be the one that always says, don't be too afraid of necessarily picking an archival standard. Like if you have a lot of resources to save a lot of TIFFs, please do that. But if you can only share or save JPEGs, don't feel like that's not archival enough for you and your family. And I think also more important, or just as important as being able to save these materials, is making sure that they're going to be shareable. So if JPEGs are easier to store for your family and their resources, and it's easier to upload a bunch of them to a website that you can all share these memories with together, then go for that over something that is a higher resolution. But also make sure it's a file format that's not going to become obsolete, which is an advantage maybe to something like a TIFF, like Neel mentioned. If there's a lot of buy-in from archival repositories about what is like an archival file type, that might ensure a longer life for that file type. Like a WAV might be a safer choice than an MP3 because archives have a cultural investment in making sure that waves are a file type that's going to last.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Nicolette. And just to jump off of that, I just wanted to say that JP2s, also called JPEG 2000s, I found that they sort of strike a good balance where they're recognized as a good format for preservation, but also the file sizes can be kept quite low with that format.
Great, thank you both. So there's actually just a question in the chat from Serena about an old email address or email account, a Hotmail account that they haven't accessed in a while. And that brings me actually to the next question I was going to ask you both, is about born digital materials. Most of us do our work now on the digital platform, right? We're using emails, creating PDFs, text messages, etc. How do you think about digital preservation for those kinds of born digital materials? Do you have any thoughts there about what one should do to make sure that those materials that are important to them are preserved?
I was waiting for Neil to go first because I am so terrible as a personal archivist for myself with my digital materials. But I will say that it's, of course, really easy to get overwhelmed because we produce so many digital materials now. One thing that I want to say is I know Ayshea and I both worked for the Texas Archive of the Moving Image, and I can't remember who it was who said this, but they said that what was really great about moving image materials was that they kind of captured the mannerisms and things like that of people more so than just a photograph or a letter might. And I feel like a lot of our everyday correspondences, like text messages or emails, capture so much about the way we were talking or inside jokes and things like that that are very kind of temporal and passing. So don't get too distracted with, scanning photographs that you forget that you should start putting in kind of a plan for how you want to deal with your digital materials. I think the best way to start with that is just thinking about kind of a plan, like saying at Christmas, we're going to talk about picking 20 emails that we want to save as part of our family album or something like that.
One of the things that you said earlier in your comments, Nicolette, that resonated with me was about not relying on commercial services to be our archive for us, because we found this, you mentioned with Google recently, but also Yahoo groups recently within the last year, that these services may become unavailable at some point in the future. And so relying entirely on them to be our archive is not necessarily always the most appropriate approach. So maybe that brings me to the question then more broadly about social media and its role in this whole conversation. We often think about social media as a way to share with family members or with friends around the world. Some of us use social media as a way to just kind of keep our own memories and our own, our photographs and other things there. But how do you think of social media's relationship to personal archives and family archives? What role does social media have in all that?
I think it's a good first filter, especially because you take so many photos and then maybe you only upload a few to Facebook or Instagram. And also things like TikTok, like people are doing a lot of cool creative things with video that maybe they're not considering like a creative endeavor, but they really are. So I think it's important to preserve all these things that we're making. But yeah, being responsible for stewarding that collection of materials that you're creating is important. I think I'm going to share in the chat a resource that's just kind of like a quick, easy guide to downloading your material from some of these third-party platforms. And it's not exhaustive at all, but just start thinking about, having a few times a year where you decide that you're going to download some of those materials and save them to the cloud or somewhere else. I think also we forgot to mention earlier on saving as many copies of something as you can in different places is also really important. If you can get another friend or family member on board and both of you kind of save the same set of materials in different locations or under different accounts, that will be really helpful in making sure that at least one of those ends up sticking around in the future.
Yeah, those are some good points. Another thing with social media is that, oftentimes people put little descriptions of the event or what's happening. So essentially that is a way, it's a sort of like a type of metadata. So when you're looking back at those photos, you have some sort of, recollection based on the way that you described it at the time. So I think that can be really helpful to refer to as well. I was also just going to say, if people purchase hard drives, you can get like a 4 terabyte hard drive for less than $100, and those are pretty large. So there's plenty of great hard drive brands, and you could just do as you were saying, Nicolette, a few times a year you could download your photos to a hard drive.
Great, thank you both so much. So now turning to the question of oral histories, and Umber, I'll be turning to you for this. So maybe we can start by just kind of defining what an oral history interview is. We talk about oral histories all the time. I feel like it's always in the air. People are always talking about oral histories, but what is an oral history interview and what is its purpose?
Yeah, so the oral history community has a kind of professional standard. And one of the things to remember is that the term oral history actually refers to two things. It refers to an interview that someone conducts with a narrator or an interviewee. And then it also, so it refers to that sort of method, the work, and then it also refers to the product of that work, the oral history interview that is created in that interaction. And we also agree, like with our professional standards, that you might do an audio or a video recording. So audio alone is sufficient to be considered an oral history. Increasingly, people are doing video. There are some questions about whether that's better or not. And I think that's something people have to decide. And then also the notion that in creating this interview, that both parties are conscious that their goal is to create a permanent record that contributes to an understanding of the past. So it's different than a conversation. It's different than an interview that might be used for journalism because we think that it's a verbal document. And that's the outcome of a process of working together to develop knowledge, the goal of which is preservation.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And so, you mentioned that this is kind of something that has to be agreed upon by both the interviewer and the interviewee. And one of the challenges I think that many of us find who are interested in our own family's histories or community histories even, is how do you get people to agree to sit down for an oral history interview? How do you get them to recognize why it's so important to co-create this document together? So how do you get them to agree? How do you ask them? Any advice you can provide there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that it's important to remember is that the purpose of the interview is to preserve for you, for your family, maybe for the public, an individual and personal story. And in my experience, when you ask someone to tell their story, you show interest in their story, they are inclined usually to share it with you. But that notion that you have to agree to preserving it for the past and, developing information for history can be intimidating. But the thing is that people think like, well, my life is not important enough, or my story is not important enough, or my story won't be a good example of what you're looking for. But how can we know the importance of a story until it's told? How can we know whether a story matters until we have the story? And part of what the oral history interview is designed to do is to collect and preserve the story. So in a collection, individual stories can illuminate the experiences of a group of people, or they might focus on a specific incident. Like my own background is in, I interviewed Muslims about their experiences of the 1947 partition. So a life-changing event can often be like a central organizing moment for an oral history interview, and that I'll talk about that in a few minutes when we talk about what to ask. But also I think just to let someone know that you want to know their story, you want to know something about their specific experience. So oral history is about specificity. It's not about generalizability. It's not about your story as representative. And so sometimes stories might not, and actually they don't have to follow an established model. They don't have to tell the story that everyone already knows. They don't have to fit a stereotype, because actually an unexpected story leads us to a deeper understanding of the complexity of the past. And that's one of the real virtues of oral history, is that it helps us to see complexity.
Thanks, Humber. That's great. And I see some hearts popping up on the screen, which I like seeing too. So once someone has agreed, and that seems very like a very compelling way to get someone to agree. Once they've agreed to sit down for an interview with you, how do you know what to ask them? How do you develop those questions that you may want to ask?
Depends on what you want to know. Right? I mean, we don't all want to know the same thing. If you're motivated to learn about the impact of a specific event on someone's life, maybe their migration, maybe 9/11, maybe the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, then you might think about that as being the central organizing moment of the interview. And a chunk of your questions will be about that. But I always start an interview with, can you spell your name for me and pronounce it the way you like to hear it pronounced, and tell me when and where you were born. Because we can talk about specific events all we want, but what makes a story meaningful is a trajectory that starts at the beginning and moves through a series of developments. So when and where were you born? And then I usually ask, can you tell me what you remember about your neighborhood or your childhood home? And that's partly because we all have developed patterns of telling about who we are. Someone meets you at a party and they say, hi, what do you do? And we have a story we tell about that. And so it's helpful for questions to nudge someone out of a rehearsed story, right? By getting them to think back to someone that some thing, some event, some image, some episode that requires them to work their memory. And from there, they will often lead you down a path, right? So narrators may tell stories in ways that you don't expect. And that's because they're telling the story the way that it matters for them, which may not be the same way that it matters for you, or it may not be what you're expected. So it's okay in an oral history interview to follow a tangent, to go down a pathway that a narrator leads you on. And it's also okay, if that pathway is too winding and long and confusing, to bring them back to what you see as the central organizing moment. But those tangents are often very rich, and they're very rich with meaning because you've asked them to tell you their story, and how they put it together really matters. Like I can remember when I interviewed my dad, I expected him to tell me the story that I had always imagined about him, which was that he came to the United States and he had achieved the American dream through self-reliance and pulling himself up by his bootstraps. But when I interviewed him, and especially when I listened back, and I think listening back is a really important part of understanding, he really talked about all the people who had helped him along the way. He really didn't talk about himself as being so important, but that he was where he was because all along the way there had been people there who had offered their support to him. And that really changed my relationship to him, and it really changed my relationship to his story.
In many cases, particularly when you're thinking about family histories and doing oral histories with family members, we're interviewing people that we may know very, very well. And there may be questions that might be like really difficult to ask, or you might know that there's some kind of area of trauma. How do you navigate difficult questions or trauma when doing an interview with someone that you're so close to?
Gently, with compassion and with permission. I often will say, you know, I would like to ask you about this event that you've referred to, or I've heard stories about. So in interviewing a family member, obviously you're in very, very sensitive story territory. People will cry, but people often welcome the opportunity to talk about something that they don't feel like they can just bring up anytime. And so your job as a listener, as an interviewer, I think more than anything is to be a good steward of that story, to make a commitment to them that you will treat it with the respect that it deserves, that you recognize the pain in it. And so I think it's really important to ask permission to create and hold space with someone. There's a lot of emotion that goes into personal storytelling. And as an interviewer, even especially if it's someone that you know, but often if it's someone that you don't, I mean, I've been in interviews with adults who sobbed, and I'd never met them until I walked into their house that day. But a gentle touch, a gentle look, if you're interviewing over Zoom, just letting them know that it's okay, that they have time and space to feel that, to experience it. And I also think that it's not helpful to shy away, to tiptoe around something that you know is there, but acknowledging that it's there can often lead to a really powerful experience for both interviewer and narrator.
I've heard you talk about this before, actually, but one of the things that you've described is how you get people to kind of break out of the narrative that they always want to tell. Like you mentioned, when you go to a party and someone asks you, what do? You tell the same story over and over again. If you're sitting down with someone that you're like close to, you know there's a deeper story there. How do you actually get them to get to that deeper story that you may be interested in?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's important to really think about what you want to know from them. And so when you put together some questions, and it's very important to have a questionnaire before you go into any interview, and that questionnaire should be informed by your research, by your knowledge. So it's actually in some ways easier to make a questionnaire to interview someone you know well, because you already have a lot of context. But don't fall back on that context in the sense that don't expect that what you know or what you think you know is all there is to know about someone's experience. And so sometimes asking questions that you think you know the answer to can get them to push a little bit, to think through something a different way. If you let them know what you think you know, we've all heard this from our parents, they'll be like, yeah, but you don't know everything. And then you say, well, then tell me more. Because sometimes the best question is actually just a statement. It's just, tell me, please tell me. And that can sometimes open up the opportunity for people to go into greater depth. Or if they tell you the pat story, say, I've heard that story my whole life. I think there's more to it. What else can you tell me? Or can you tell me about a specific memory with that person or a specific event? Because again, oral history is about specificity, and the memory has to work to recreate that specificity. And that's really where the rich meaning is.
Can you talk a little bit about how to navigate language issues? Perhaps you're interviewing someone and whether you're not as comfortable in the same language as them. How do you navigate that when you're doing an oral history interview?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of my favorite interviews of all time is one I did with my grandmother, and I'll post a link to it if I can pull it up, where you can actually hear my voice and my grandmother's voice, which was really scratchy, and she's speaking in Urdu, and my Urdu is really, especially then, was like real iffy. So I was working with a young cousin of mine who's a teenager, and you can hear in the interview us kind of working through how to get from what I'm trying to ask to what my cousin can comprehend as a young teenager to actually what my grandmother, who also had hearing loss, can actually understand and respond to. And she was very hesitant about the microphone. She didn't like it at all. So the whole interview only lasted 15 minutes, but it's such a gift because I have her voice. So get a translator, get somebody who you trust or who your narrator trusts, who can be an intermediary. And because you are recording the responses, you'll have an opportunity to revisit the translation. What you need to be able to do in the context of a multilingual, bilingual, or multilingual interview is to keep pushing to meaning. If you don't understand something, ask for clarification in the moment. That's not something to wait for, because even if you can only understand simple words in someone else's language, you can ask them to repeat it in simple words for you, and you still can get something out of that. And if you have any language skill in the language your narrator is speaking, use it when you can, because that's a great way of creating connection.
So thinking now specifically about just like how you actually do this, right? So you've gotten someone to agree to an interview, you have your set of questions that you want to start from. Like, how long should an oral history interview be? How do you actually do the interview? What equipment do you need? What are the conditions that you need? Can you just give some general guidance there?
Yeah, well, it depends. So I tend to think it depends on who you're interviewing and what your context is. But I think for me, about an hour and a half is how long I set aside for kind of a standard interview that I do. An hour feels too short to kind of really get into the meat of a question. You spend a lot of time kind of establishing context, talking about childhood. My method thinks of oral history interviews as a life history interview. So I do spend a lot of time establishing context. So an hour feels a little too short for me. For my students, an hour feels like an eternity to them because they've never done it before. 2 hours is a long time to sit. It's a long time to be engaged in a one-on-one conversation. And so 1.5 hours for me kind of splits the difference. If you need to take breaks, take breaks. A lot of the people I have interviewed have been quite elderly. And so it was really helpful to be able to get up, use the bathroom, walk around, stretch your legs. But if you're going to do that, take notes. You will regret it if you don't. Make sure you're jotting down notes all along. And when you take a break in the conversation, take notes about what you were talking about when you stopped, because everybody forgets. You stop, you have a cup of tea, you eat a cookie, you come back, you're like, oh, where was I? So take good notes. And you can also do multiple interviews. So you can come back to someone and ask more questions later. As far as what you need and your equipment and like the logistics of it, the first thing you need is quiet. And the second thing you need is time. Beyond that, there's a lot of options. So having some recording equipment, some kind of recording equipment that allows you to record uncompressed audio, ideally, is helpful. I use a little handheld recorder. It's only this big. The nice thing about it is you can see it's really small. And so I like this because it's unobtrusive. When I was doing the interviews for my dissertation, I used a similar recorder with a clip-on microphone, but this one I don't even use a clip-on microphone. That's all it is. But honestly, the voice memos app on your phone can work. I use another app called Belkin iTalk. So a little bit of research will get you some good information. There are a lot of these handheld recorders out there. There's a company called Zoom that makes handheld recorders. So not this same Zoom, but another Zoom. They make a Zoom H4, H5. They have different features. The nice thing about those is they have 2 microphones. You can record in stereo. You would like to record uncompressed in WAV files, if possible. And then you talk about, 44.1, 16-bit. There's all kinds of numbers associated with it. If a 10-second Google search will yield those numbers, and you can compare them to what the manual for this recorder is bigger than the recorder itself, but it'll give you all the specs for what kind of audio you want to be able to get. Yeah, so I've definitely used my phone when I had to record spontaneously, but if I have time to plan, I really strongly prefer using a handheld recorder. You can just put it on the table, set it and forget it, and it's got plenty. You can get SD cards that are big enough to hold many hours of interview. And the quality is good enough.
And right now during the pandemic, in many ways, it feels like life is on hold for so many of us, but can you do interviews on Zoom or on Skype? And any considerations in terms of doing interviews remotely that might be different?
Yeah, so in our list of resources, we'll share a platform that has been designed specifically for conducting video oral histories. It's called Their Story. And so you can look that up, theirstory.io. Zoom isn't bad, actually. And the nice thing about both Their Story and Zoom is that they will create transcripts for you. The transcripts are not reliable, so you'll need to go back for sure and edit them again. But you can record audio. Zoom will do the audio track separate from the video track. So look at your settings. Then you can decide if you want to keep the video and the audio separately. It's nice to be able to look at somebody that you're interviewing, but it may not be better for preservation. So you just have to decide what you want. I think a big thing to consider for all of the things we're discussing is your priorities and what your goals are, and make your decisions around that. So if you're interviewing somebody far away, I'd say consider Zoom or consider their story. If you are, a lot of people may be ready to interview people who are in their family or in their pod, you know, since no one can ever leave our homes, pick a Saturday night when you might go out and do something else in normal life, and set that time aside to sit down and speak and share and record with your family. I do have a release form that I ask people to sign. That's another thing to consider. I talked about trauma before, and asking permission is important, and getting consent, being honest with your narrator about what you want to use the interview for. If it's really just for your family, that's something you can agree to. It's not something that should be assumed. And so when we share the resources, I've also put a release form there that's pretty simple, that just asks people what they're comfortable having their materials used for. And there have been some questions in the chat about security, about privacy. I think it's really important to think carefully about these things. As someone pointed out, you know, Islamophobia, racism, caste bias, there are all kinds of reasons to be protective of our stories and the stories of people that we love and care about. And so again, I think it's important to remember that your job as a member of a family, as a member of a community, as a member of this project is to be a good steward and to be really thoughtful about how you imagine using these materials, and inviting the participants that you're working with, your family members, to say what they want and need.
Amber, thank you. That was so great. That was so helpful. So turning briefly back to Ayshea and Tara, to this question of metadata. So this is a term that someone brought up, I think, earlier at some point. And one of the things that's really important in archives is thinking about contextual information, right? You have a photograph, you may not know who is in the photograph, for example. Could you talk a little bit about this idea of metadata, and then why is it so important? And then how do we as home archivists think about metadata in our context?
Yeah, that's a great point, Samip. So thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, metadata is kind of a technical archival term that we use to describe any information that is describing an object. So like Samip mentioned, as an archivist, I come across photograph collections that are beautiful, you know, documenting Asian American families like in the early 1900s. And while the images are really evocative and beautiful, sometimes there's no other information. You look on the back of the photograph and I don't know who the person is, where the family may be convening in the photograph, what time period, the exact time period. So when we talk about metadata, particularly for family archiving, I think those are the kinds of questions that you should capture when you know them. So similar to when Amber was talking about getting that oral history when they're there in front of you and you can capture that. If you're working with your family materials, photo albums, maybe letters or digital records, if you know who is in the photograph or the time or the date or the location, capture that information. If you are working with physical materials, you can write that on the back of the photograph, but I would recommend using a soft lead pencil. Don't use a Sharpie or another kind of magic marker to write, because that will damage the back of the photograph over time. They do make archival photo pens, so you can do a search for that, but I would recommend just a soft lead pencil. Don't press too hard on the back of the photograph. Putting it actually on the back of the photograph is better than putting it on another piece of paper that could get separated from the photo later down the road. So that's my recommendation about metadata, and you may not have the answer. So again, returning back to my advice of developing a network, this can be a great opportunity, great community moment with your family, whether it's via Zoom and you're holding up a photograph and you can capture it all together when you're doing a family Zoom hangout. You could take a quick photo of the photograph with your phone and put it in your WhatsApp chat to see. Someone else mentioned that they do that with their WhatsApp family to see what memories surface, and you can capture that information that way. So those are just some different tips around metadata that I would recommend for physical material. Tara, are there other kind of information that we should be capturing?
Sometimes you just want to also think about the subjects and kind of putting sometimes like objects together, whether it's locations, talking about, to talk about a specific place. So when we were talking earlier about like kind of putting some photographs together, that may be a good thing. And also what Nicolette and Neel were talking about with, tagging of things, sometimes that also makes it easier. And that is another form of metadata to kind of bring your materials back together.
Thank you both. So we're getting towards the end of the workshop. I know we've shared a lot of information with all of you today. I just wanted to see if there's any final concluding thoughts that any of our panelists would like to share.
I would just say I'm really glad that we ended with Amber's portion because it really stresses, I think, what we're all here for. Like, you can get into so many nitty-gritty details about the act of archiving, but the most important thing that we're trying to do is preserve the memories of the South Asian American experience, which there isn't a lot of history preserved in institutional archives. And even if it's not going to go to a community archive like SAADA, preserving that even just on the micro scale for your family is still really important. I know there was some conversation about some people trying to convince people if it's worth it, why even start an archiving project. But I hope that, people realize that those stories are important to share and someone in your family or a friend of yours will want that story.
Thanks, Nicolette. Maybe one more comment from anyone?
I think a big thing is also the archival community itself is fairly small and we are all willing to help. So whether you reach out to one of us who spoke today, whether you reach out to a local archivist in your community, an archivist is really going to be a person who is going to want to talk about your project, want to help in some way. And we have such weird knowledge about what to do with these things, and we want to share that with others. And so I do highly recommend, if people, we gave so much information today, but if there is more information that you need, please do feel free to reach out to, I think, any of us or any of your local archivists.
Great. Oh, Umber, go ahead.
I was just going to drop one little thing in, which is that saving something is doing something. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to save every story, every photo, every email. Save something, because that's so much better than nothing. And when you do, preserve context to the extent that you can. That's what metadata is about. That's what labeling is about, is creating context, because that's what shows us why it matters to you and why it might matter or should matter to somebody else. So as you collect, think about the why.
Thanks, Umber. Please, everyone, join me in giving our panelists a round of spirit fingers. That was so helpful. I learned so much, and I'm so grateful to all of you for this. I also want to thank my colleague Mariam, who's renamed herself tech support over there, for helping keeping us all together today. I also want to thank our sponsors for today's event. Just a reminder from what you saw in the event program: Abbas Law PLLC, Masala My Life, and Praveen and Nita Popat and family, and as well as a few other anonymous donors for supporting and making today's event possible. As I mentioned, early in 2021, we're going to be sending you a link for a new SAADA project where you'll be able to upload some of these materials that you're collecting from your own family, so we can create a SAADA family album that includes materials from our broader community. And so keep an eye out for that. And finally, just thank you all again so much for joining us today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday and the rest of your weekend, and hope to see you all again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.